Ready?
Welcome to Healthy Living with the Bourgeois. I'm your host, Jesse Bourgeois, here with my wife, Chantel. And today we're doing a Q&A episode. We had a lot of really great questions come in. We narrowed it down to about 15. Some require a little bit longer answers. Some will be pretty short and simple. Are you ready to just jump in?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, first question. How do you find eating vegan in a group or family setting?
Okay. At the beginning when we first started, it was hard, to be honest. It was weird feelings. Like it was almost like guilt almost. Cause like when we went over to like my family's or wherever, we would like bring our own food. And it's definitely weird at first because it's like you're not like partaking with the family and like having their food. And especially like I found like the first like Christmas and Thanksgiving and kind of things like that where you always have like all that kind of food. And then like, yeah, we were bringing like our own stuff. It's weird. It was definitely weird. It was hard to handle at the beginning. And then like some people would ask, like say comments like, oh, like, what are you eating today? And it was like always like a big deal. But like over time it got way better. And like now totally fine. Like we just bring our own food. No one really says anything. Sometimes they want to like try it if it's something interesting that we made. But it's totally fine now. And like all those feelings have gone, thankfully. But yeah, it's good now. How did you find it?
Yeah, so it's different now. So when I first went vegan, before you and I were a couple, when I was at university, it was pretty easy. I didn't find it in like social settings and that type of thing wasn't much of a problem at all. When I moved home and I started living with my family again, I actually stopped being vegan basically because of that social setting. It was just too complicated because people were cooking me dinners and it was awkward, and I wasn't at a maturity level to express my beliefs in a way to try to get people to understand. So at that time, it was really challenging and actually just sort of made me put it to the side and to just go back to eating how I did before. When I would cook for myself, I'd make vegan food. But if other people cooked for me, I didn't want to be that person. So I would just kind of ignore it. I have noticed with the both of us doing it is a lot easier. Having someone else who's also going through the same thing as you at the same time has been really nice. And I'm very grateful that this is something that we're doing together and it's not just one of us. Cause
me too.
I really feel for people when they're in like either they're at home or they're in a setting where they feel like they're on their own doing it. It can be super challenging in those types of settings. So yeah. And it's tricky because especially with family, like in a sense, you're expressing that, hey, like, I know you fed me my whole life, right? Especially if it's a parent. And now it's like, but I think what you're doing is wrong and I don't want to partake in it. It can be a difficult thing to sort of have that dynamic happening with your family. So, it's tricky. This question is probably one of the hardest and is probably one of the reasons why a lot of people struggle with making that decision to try going fully plant-based, even if they feel like they want to. It's a huge barrier for sure.
Yeah. Awkward is a good word to use, actually.
Yeah.
It is kind of awkward. And that actually is a good point. Like by yourself, like I probably would have caved too. Yeah, like it's hard. I'm such a people pleaser. Like it's super hard.
And especially like we're in such a small town. There isn't a big like vegan community here.
Yeah.
Again, when I was in Kelowna, it was really easy. A lot of my friends were like vegetarian or kind of plant forward, or like people were dabbling in the idea of it, and it was a lot more accepted within the community, it felt like. Whereas here, it's limited. There isn't a lot of people that are choosing to follow that path. So it's a little bit different. It feels a little bit more isolating in small rural areas, I think.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Okay, question 2. How do you eat vegan on the road, or if fast food is the only option?
Yeah, really good question. So a couple things to note on this. Even before we were vegan, we didn't eat a lot of fast food while traveling. We would typically plan ahead. And usually if you're somewhere where there's a fast food option, there's a grocery store in the same town or location or where you're going. Worst case scenario, there might only be like convenience stores, but there's still typically other types of stores. So we, most of the time, and even now more so doing the vegan thing, but even before that, would just utilize those types of stores in order to purchase snacks and different things while on the go. A lot of grocery stores have like little sandwich bars and different things like that, where you can get these sort of packaged on the go foods that are a little bit more healthful than fast food restaurants. And typically not really that much more expensive. They're pretty close in price depending on what kinds of snacks and different things that you get. The other piece is like nowadays, it's nice that most fast food restaurants have some vegan options. So even if that is something that you choose to do, there's usually some that have the case. Like A&W has the Beyond Meat burgers. Like there's typically some type of option available, which is great. And then in larger centers, like we go to the Chopped Leaf all the time.
Super good.
When we travel, because it's awesome. It's really
very filling.
And it's fast. It's not very expensive. And you can tweak it. So you can use animal-based options, or they have tofu and different plant-based options. The build it your own style places are great because there's almost always a way to work around animal products being in it. Anything else come to mind for you, like through our travels? Because we've been tons of different places now while doing this, and we haven't really ran into any issues.
It's nice when we are in like the bigger centers, because there is like a lot of vegan options, which is nice. And then like usually like the day there, we like pack our own food, so like we have all that. And like a couple different little tips, like if you were traveling somewhere, if you know ahead of time that you're going to go there and if you're going to be there for a while, almost every town has like a vegan community Facebook page. You can just hop on that page and ask people where's the best places to go. There's also apps that do that for especially cities, like rural communities. There's not as much for that type of thing, but I think it's called A Billion is an app that has where people can you can log vegan options on the app. So then as you're traveling, you can just go on that app and check things out. Like there's lots of different ways of finding out. Even when we went to Calgary, I just Googled like best vegan food in Calgary. And then a bunch of little cafes and different options come up and different reviews on Google and different things. So there's usually a way of figuring it out. It just might take a little extra planning, but I would argue, even if you're not eating vegan, you should plan ahead anyways, so that you can find just good food. We're kind of foodies a little bit, but it's nice to sort of know your food spots before you travel, because then you can get really good food. And pastries.
All right, question number 3. Do you guys find eating vegan expensive with our food going up in price?
So since we've been married, I have never bought meat. We've never bought meat since we've been married. People have like given us stuff, but we never we were always kind of vegetarian, like from the get-go, kind of since we got married. So like for me, like I haven't really noticed like that much of a difference. But I'm gonna bounce it over to you. Give a bit more. So I'll give the kind of research side of this, and then our personal experience side of this. So in 2022, there's 2 papers that were published that looked at this. So this is something that actually has been looked at and researched quite a bit, mainly healthful diets versus less healthy, more ultra processed food diets is a topic of research, and that's branched into some of these more kind of like niche category types of research. So 2 different papers, one by Hohoff and one by Paez, and they both found that healthful vegan diets were no more expensive than healthful omnivorous diets.
So there doesn't seem to be a big difference in price between a healthful vegan diet and a healthful omnivorous diet. There is a big price difference between a healthy diet and an unhealthy diet, a diet that is comprised of more processed foods.
Right.
So yeah, if you're wanting to eat a higher quality diet as per a diet quality index, it's going to cost more money, unfortunately. I could rant for a really long time about that and subsidies and why that's the case. I won't today, but we can talk about that more maybe another time. So unfortunately, it is the reality that if you want to eat a healthful diet, it's going to cost more than a less healthy diet. But if you want to eat a vegan healthful diet versus an omnivorous healthful diet, there really doesn't seem to be much of a case. In our personal experience, there's a couple things that we've done in order to make our budget a little bit nicer when it comes to eating a vegan diet. And it really comes down to your swaps. So if you're eating an animal-based diet and then you switch over and you start eating a plant-based diet, whatever that means to you, if it's full vegan, if it's not, whatever it might be, what you really start doing in your planning phase is identifying your swaps. So if I'm no longer eating meat, what am I going to eat instead? What am I going to swap this with? And you have a handful of different options. You have your plant-based meat alternatives. You have things like tofu. And then you have things that aren't as good as protein sources, but still have some protein in them, like beans, lentils, stuff like that. So when we made our swap, we prioritized tofu as the main meat swap because per price per calorie and per gram of protein is actually typically cheaper than meat. So it saves us a little bit of money, which is great. The plant-based meat alternatives are not. They're not very financially friendly, especially if you're doing like Beyond Meat burgers or those types of things. And they're just more processed. Yeah. So we're not going to use that as our main swap for meat products. Gardein, there are some more kind of economically friendly plant-based alternatives that we might have once a week, just because they're good and why not? Enjoy life and your food a little bit. So those swaps are kind of the case. And like when we make recipes that swap legumes for things like beef, so making like a black bean and lentil chili versus one with beef in it, it's actually quite a lot cheaper. Lentils and beans are super cheap in comparison per calorie than meat. Per gram of protein, not necessarily the case. That's why they're not a great alternative. Right. So there's this swap game that happens a little bit. With dairy products, it's pretty equal. There isn't a lot of additional cost with vegan options, except for things like yogurt and stuff like that is a little bit more expensive. But then you save money in the case of like, we never buy butter, and butter apparently is expensive from what we hear. But we use just different types of oils, which are typically really cheap. So there's some trade-off with that type of thing. Replacements for milk, pretty close to the same price, depending on what you get and if you shop sales and different things like that. But fortified plant-based milk options are pretty much the same per calorie cost as a dairy product. And cheese is a bit more expensive as well. If you want to get like a good vegan cheese, you're probably going to pay a little bit more than an animal-based cheese. So it depends. Like you play the game a little bit, but I really think where people make the mistake is when they use the plant-based meat alternatives, like the processed plant-based meat alternatives, as their primary swap for meat products. That will make your costs go up. But if you're just choosing whole foods and stuff like tofu and different things like that, it's arguably the same price as per research and in our personal experience. Same. Because you're not swapping vegetables. No. Like that's sort of the piece with this is like, if you're eating a healthful omnivorous diet, you're buying fruits and vegetables anyways. When you go vegan, that's not a swap that's happening, right? So you're still just eating the same amount of fruits and vegetables, most likely. Yeah. You're swapping protein sources and dairy sources and stuff like that. So that's the unfortunate part, because those are the things that are going up in price. So it's going up for everybody. Healthy diet in general is just more expensive, which sucks. But that's just unfortunately the reality of it. So this question was for you. What are we at? Question number 5? Question number 4. How did Chantel find transitioning to a vegan diet? How was your transition to a vegan diet?
Okay, in 2019, we weren't quite married. It was in June. We did a month of vegan that year, and I was still living at home. You had your apartment already, or your place. That was hard because at home, of course, I'm trying to make my own meals. My family's all making their meals. We're trying to like use the space in the kitchen and like things like that. I found very challenging. Plus, like, I was doing it by well, you were like kind of helping me, like giving me ideas and stuff like that. But like, that was my first time doing it.
You're essentially doing it by yourself.
It was challenging, like trying to figure out like, the swaps, trying to get enough like protein, like all that kind of stuff. Like I found that very challenging. And then also like, being at home where they're not eating like that, that was hard. When we got married, we kind of like started off just vegetarian. And that was totally fine. When we switched to vegan, like at the beginning, so that would have been like January 1, 2022. Mm-hmm. I missed like cheddar cheese a lot. Like I noticed like some of my cravings. Like once in a while I would like if we were at one of our families and like they were having steak, like once in a while I would like have like a craving. Once we got down like the rabbit hole farther of like the ethics and like our values and stuff like that, like those, like the meat part went away. But for a while I really craved like cheddar cheese. Well, we were using like the Daiya cheese and it's not
the same.
Very tasty and like the texture is wrong. So we found the brand, I think is like soya something.
Can't remember.
But it's like a mozzarella.
One. Yeah.
But it's like mozzarella and it actually tastes like mozzarella and like the texture's perfect. So like once I like got my hands on that, I was fine. But we were like, we were already eating vegetarian. So like, it wasn't that hard to like switch. It was fine.
Yeah. It wasn't a big, I won't ramble too long, but I'll add a little bit of a 2 cents of just from experience of talking to people. A slower transition sometimes is better. When it's not a huge jump, I think it's easier because we kind of progressively transitioned into we ate plant-based at home, but we weren't very strict when we went out to family members or restaurants. And then we progressively got kind of more and more towards this plant exclusive type of diet. So then when we made that final little leap into a vegan diet, it wasn't a big leap.
No,
there was like
wasn't.
a couple things that we just had to find the right swap for. Like
exactly.
The cheese. And that's the beautiful thing about nowadays is
there's lots of options, which is nice.
Yeah, you're really just like swapping. And every now and then I get like bummed of like, Creston doesn't have all these like really great swaps that exist in cities.
Yeah.
If we're in certain cities, it'd be even easier to do this type of thing. But you do have to test and trial and error to try to find stuff that works the same way.
It's funny because like, so in June in 2019, like it was super hard, but I noticed like the changes in my body though were like amazing. Because I remember like my skin was like cleared up and was like so nice. My hair, like I had like a lot of energy, like those things were really nice, but like the prep and stuff like that was hard. So it was interesting to see that.
Yeah.
Okay, this next question. Thoughts on eating local free-range eggs from happy, well taken care of chickens as a vegan?
Yeah, so okay, I have two thoughts on this. I will say eggs have been one of the things we've gone back and forth with. Yep. But these are the two things that come to my mind where I'm not stoked on the idea. First, male chicks are just killed immediately, basically typically at like a day old, because meat chickens and egg laying chickens are not the same type of chicken. So the males of the egg laying kind of chicken aren't good for anything in the eyes of animal agriculture. So they just get killed immediately. Typically it's just, they're either like macerated, they go into a giant grinder while they're still alive. Obviously they're still alive while they're still conscious, I should say. Or they get suffocated. There's different ways of going about it, but it's like in the States, 100 million male chicks are just slaughtered every year. And Canada does the same thing. So that isn't great. That kind of deters me quite a bit. And the second part is, what's the fate of the hens when their egg production goes down or stops. If this is in the question is local happy while taking care of chickens. If somewhere was letting those hens just live out the rest of their lives and not too worried about it, if they stop production, that's great. And that would be a wonderful thing. I'd be really happy about that. And that's kind of where we've gone back and forth is identifying places that do that and then purchasing eggs, but that doesn't bypass the male chick part. It's created this sort of roundabout issue, but I don't know what people are going to do when the hens stop producing. And that kind of highlights the problem. My issue with it is the mindset of these are commodities. They're just a means of it to an end. They're just like a production tool, like anything else, like a printer that prints pages for you. Once it stops being productive, then it's not of use and it gets discarded. That mindset is really my whole issue. And we're going to talk more about like the values and veganism stuff, but that is to me the kind of crux of the problem is that they're just viewed as like a commodity that's dispensable and they're not viewed as like a living, breathing thing that deserves some respect. That's sort of where I'm at with it. But I mean, that getting local free range eggs is way better than getting eggs from hens that are stuck in battery cages. Like way better from a point of suffering. So I don't want to be discouraging of that. If people are going to eat eggs, that's how it should be done. But I'm still not super stoked about it.
Yeah, like right now we're not eating eggs. It was probably like a month ago or so.
Yeah,
like
we've gone back and forth.
We have, yeah, and like omelets and French toast for me. Like that's what I was like missing. And so we went and got local free range eggs from Happy Chickens. But then like the first couple times we had like the French toast and stuff like that, like so good. But then like near the end, like the last couple of times, there was like, I could smell the barn and like we had chickens growing up and like that smell will forever be there. And it's horrible of like cleaning out the chicken coop. Like it was awful. And I got like a whiff of that, like right before I like took my first bite and I was like, ugh, gross. So that's kind of like, after that, I was like, I'm good for a while. Plus since then, Jesse makes a delicious tofu scramble and it's so good. So like that part is good for me. And then I just recently found a really good French toast recipe that's completely vegan. I think it's from the Love of Lemons cookbook.
Oh, great, yeah.
So you can like find it online. I can like post it at some point. It was delicious. It was super good. It like, because sometimes when you make a recipe, when you like really, really like something like French toast and it like doesn't taste the same, it's not the same. So then like I was struggling with that a little bit. But yeah, since finding that recipe, I'm good. And so like with the egg thing, with that smell, I'm good for a while. Like, yeah, couldn't do it.
Yeah, it's one of these things where it's not a need anymore. From an enjoyment perspective, like you just talked about, and from a nutrient perspective, I don't see a reason for us to go about it unless we like really felt the need to. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Next question. Curious to hear your opinion on vegan, vegetarian diet and pregnancy.
So I've also been curious about this, but Jesse has all the research, so I'm going to let him answer this one.
So, disclaimer, I'm not a registered dietitian, not a doctor. If this is something that you're particularly interested in, talk to your healthcare professional. Just want to get that out there. So there's a couple things that come up quite often in research, additionally in research regarding vegetarian and veganism and pregnancy. And those concerns tend to center around protein, iron, omega-3s, iodine, calcium, vitamin D, and vitamin B12. So those are sort of what we call like nutrients of concern. Now, there's nutrients of concern with omnivorous diets, vegetarian diets, vegan diets, and every sort of diet combination that you can think of. Right. So this isn't, I want to make it clear, this isn't like a vegan issue, but a vegan diet has specific nutrients of concern because you tend to get more of some things, but then less of other things. That's just the game you play no matter what dietary pattern you pick.
Right.
So there's always certain things that you need to kind of pay attention to and be careful with. Now, on that, there is some observational data that sort of shows that there's low gestational weight for babies and some premature terms for babies in people who follow a vegan diet compared to an omnivorous diet. But there's some observational studies that show the exact opposite, with higher weight of babies from vegan mothers versus omnivorous mothers. There's a mix of observational data, which is a problem because nutrition research is quite complicated. And when we rely on questions that only have observational data to try to answer them, there's so much that can be missed with that. So it's really hard to draw conclusions. Typically, you don't draw any formal conclusions from observational data like that. You try to get randomized control trials. There's a thing called a hierarchy of evidence it's basically a hierarchy of evidence. I was trying to think of another way to say it. Like it helps you visualize and understand what types of research are higher quality evidence compared to other types of research. So meta-analyses and systematic reviews are good higher quality levels of research, especially when they're meta-analyses or systematic reviews of randomized control trials, where you're actually controlling the situation and measuring outcomes and so on. I don't want to get into the details of research methods right now. We can talk about that again on a next Q&A maybe. But observational data falls relatively low on that hierarchy. It's not great data. So usually you want to use the questions that come up from observational data and then run randomized control trials and then find out an answer. To my knowledge, there is no randomized control trials of vegan mothers or even vegetarian mothers having kids. So I don't know. I don't know what to think. What I get from this mixed observational data is that it becomes very individual, because clearly in some contexts it can be detrimental. And then clearly in some contexts it seems to be totally fine. Some contexts, those nutrients of concern I mentioned seem to be low in baby and mom. In some contexts there doesn't seem to be any issues. So what I gather from that is like, okay, those are things you need to pay attention to. And
Right.
if you're following a dietary pattern that is adequate in those things, you're probably just fine. The red flag is that if you're not paying attention, there's a greater chance of concern potentially. So it becomes a very individual thing where you need to monitor your diet a little bit more carefully and work with a professional.
Yeah,
That's really
exactly.
the best idea. But I also just want to point out, like, for me, one of the things that comes up with this is like remembering the whole point of this. Veganism to me is a harm reduction philosophy, because it's never going to be perfect. No matter what type of food you consume, there's going to be some suffering to animals and planet and everything else as a result of that. The idea is to make the choices that result in the least amount possible. If you put me on an island and there's food scarcity on that island and there's animals there, I'm going to hunt and eat those animals.
Yeah.
In our context, with a grocery store and all of these things accessible, I don't have to do that. So it becomes a choice.
Yeah.
So then there's some moral responsibility attached to that choice. That's sort of the idea. If you're pregnant and let's say you have, you just can't stand the taste of certain things because of the pregnancy or whatever's going on. And as a result, you're on this vegan diet, you can't consume certain things and you're starting to get some nutritional deficiencies. It's harm reduction. What's more important, the health of the baby or the harm of some animals?
Right.
You're going to pick the health of the baby.
100%.
So remembering why you're doing it, I also think is really important. I've heard really sad stories of people maintaining extremely strict vegan diets and they're being harmed to children. That's terrible. That should not happen. To me, it misses the whole point. So that's just something that kind of comes to mind with this is like, it seems very possible to follow through with it and do the thing, but it seems very individual.
Yeah.
And just remembering why you're doing this thing to begin with. You don't want to cause harm to this child. So it'd be making the choices that are necessary, but understanding their choices. So yeah, and work with a professional. Cool. It's a good question though.
Totally.
Something I actually want to learn more about. And actually I should just mention, I'll put a link to a systematic, it's a narrative review, but it's still a systematic review. They did a good job, where they kind of talk about where we're at with research on this question of vegan diets and mothers. I'll link that below so you can check it out. And when I mention a professional, I just want to clarify, I'm talking like a registered dietitian or somebody with like a master's degree or some sort of higher level education in, prenatal or perinatal nutrition, not just like a nutritionist or someone who's like a self-claimed expert in your town.
Yeah.
Find a legitimate qualified professional to work with on this. Cool.
Okay, next question. Can you provide a list of foods that you eat on a regular basis to maintain fullness sustainably? I have a hard time understanding your daily eating and want to know more.
Yeah, so this is a really great question. I'm curious. A lot of these were anonymous. Some of them weren't, but I know of a few people who I've had conversations with where they fall into the same camp as me, and I apologize for everyone who's not in this camp, where we have a hard time maintaining and gaining weight. We fall into that category of people. So a plant-based diet, I don't think this is a good reason to go plant-based, but an association or an outcome that is typical of a plant-based diet is weight loss. It is something that typically does happen when people go plant-based. Not a good reason to go plant-based, but it tends to be an outcome that happens. So if you're someone like me who has a hard time maintaining weight or gaining weight, that can be a negative thing. You don't really want that to happen. You want to try to, stay full and put on weight potentially as you go. So from all the running and stuff we did the last couple of years, I've gained just over 10 pounds since the end of last August. So September, October, November, December, January, February, March. So 7-ish months, I've gained about 10 pounds. I think it would be closer to 15 pounds if I hadn't gotten sick so many times through this process.
Sorry about that.
Because I keep kind of like getting my weight up and then I get sick and I lose my appetite and it comes down a little bit. And so it's been more of a roller coaster than I expected.
Yeah.
So what I eat on a regular basis is relatively straightforward. I would say we follow kind of like flexible, intuitive eating in a sense. I'm actually working on something around that I'll release soon. But we like a typical day, protein shake when we get up, some sort of higher protein toast. So like squirrely bread, you could do Ezekiel bread or something else too, but we do squirrely bread with almond butter and jam or banana or something like that. Snack of like a protein bar, nuts and seeds, just like random miscellaneous stuff. Lunch is a lot of times leftovers from dinner the night before, or something like oatmeal or something like that. Another snack kind of mid-afternoon is usually something a little bit more processed, whether it's like tortilla chips or something like that. Then we have dinners. We have a sort of a menu that we follow. So a lot of like stir fries, Buddha bowls, even stuff like nachos, burgers, different things like that. We have a pretty big variety when it comes to dinners. And then usually we have some sort of dessert after, maybe some fruit. And then I get hungry at nighttime. So then I tend to eat a lot of like different types of snacks in the evening. That's a pretty typical day. It doesn't deviate a lot from that. I think there's a couple mistakes that people make. There isn't good and bad foods. There's just foods that have more healthful outcomes and foods that are associated with less healthful outcomes. And it's just creating a balance of those types of things. There's lots of research to support that a more rigid diet, where there's this kind of dichotomous thinking of like good foods, bad foods, actually tends to lead to less health outcomes long-term, because it creates ongoing struggles in different ways, whether it's related to diet and stuff in itself or whatever it might be. And it creates this weird mental game where you like consume these quote unquote bad foods, and it is like, oh, this is like my last soiree with these sinful foods, and you kind of binge on it, but then you inevitably do it again, and it creates this stress and conflict and all this sort of stuff. Being more flexible about it and being a little bit more intuitive of just listening to your hunger cues and eating foods and not seeing them as good or bad, but all foods fit in a different way, I think is really helpful, because then when you're trying to gain weight, I just listen to my hunger cues in the sense of when I feel full, I get a little extra full, and it's not uncomfortable, but I just try to get a little extra full when I'm in this like weight gain journey. And when it comes to food selection, I'm way more liberal with processed foods, because it's just, I can eat, there's higher calories, there's not as much fiber, so I don't get as much like bloating or indigestion. And I think those are mistakes that sometimes people make. They go vegan or plant-based and they get really into this idea of like whole foods, totally natural, everything. And so a lot of that's like really high fiber, low calorie stuff, which can be good, but in the context of like trying to fuel our active lives and for me to put on weight is not good. It's a bad idea. It'd be really, really challenging to do that. And I'd probably end up eating too much fiber, ironically, because that's something that most people don't get enough of. And then my gut would hurt and different things like that. So yeah, we can talk more about the food quality stuff in the future, but that's sort of the gist of it.
Yeah. When we first got married, I was also following Jesse's hunger cues. So for any of you ladies out there who are not in that camp of like having a hard time keeping weight on.
Yeah.
Listen to your hunger cues and not your man's hunger cues. When we first got married, I was like plating up my plate the same as his. And then like I was full after dinner. I'm a morning eater. If I do not eat when I wake up, angry bear, like, feed me when I get up. And Jesse's like, yeah, he's like, after dinner time, he'll like snack all night long. Like it is crazy. I don't know where he puts it. And I was like eating with you. You'd make snacks after dinner and I would eat them with you. And I gained like an extra 10 pounds when we first got married. I was like, no way. Like I'm not hungry. So now I listen to my hunger cues. And after dinner, like I'm good. I'll have like a little bowl of fruit or like a little piece of something after, but I'm good. And I can, like, you can have your stuff and I'm good. So yes, listen to your personal hunger cues.
That's a really good point.
Oh man.
All right, next question. So now we're moving more into some of the more relationship-y types of questions. This is a really sweet one. Your partnership marriage appears to be absolute goals. What are some things that have caused tension or required more effort to work through?
That is really sweet for whoever said that. It's funny, we were talking about this one. We've had like some very deep open conversations. They don't really bring tension, like maybe like the required more effort to work through part. But we have like very open communication, and like even if we disagree on something, we are able to just have a conversation about it and like get really deep. But not really cause a lot of tension. I guess maybe certain times of the month it could cause a little bit of tension, but like I'm able to thankfully like in my head, like, okay, I know what's happening with my body. Like I can just let that go. But yeah, like we've not much causes a lot of like, I wouldn't say like tension, like maybe stressful. If it's a stressful conversation, we're both kind of in the same boat, but yeah. Thoughts on this?
No, I was thinking about it too. A couple of things come to mind, but one is like, I don't think we try to own the other person's emotions or experience. We just try to understand and support. Yeah. So I feel like that has been hugely helpful, because when we have conversations, if I say something that maybe, doesn't totally jive with you or the other way around, we don't take that on as like a personal thing. Yeah. We're there to support each other through this experience that we're having. So I think that, like when I was thinking about the way that we interact with some of those harder conversations, that's kind of what comes to mind. Is like, we're not owning each other's statements. Right. We're in this journey together, and we're just trying to help each other through it in whatever way that we can. So that comes to mind. From like the more effort to work through, I I've had some challenges, particularly over the last like 2 years, with some mental health related things, and maybe we can talk more about that another time. And I sometimes feel like that must be challenging for you and must require, like, I know you put in effort to figure out the best way to support me through those things, whether it's to give me space or to do something really sweet, or how to navigate that, because I haven't been very good at regulating those emotions when I'm in those frames of mind when they're happening. And sometimes they go on for a while, so you're navigating that for kind of multiple days at a time before I sort of snap out of it. So I'm very grateful that hasn't been something that's caused any sort of significant tension, but I know it must require more effort for you. But,
maybe a little bit sometimes. But again, like I try to just put myself in your shoes and like see how I would want you to treat me. Yeah.
You're very sweet.
So are you. Okay, the next question is, do you both want kids? Yep.
Yeah, that's kind of an easy one. And actually, the next question sort of leads into that a little bit. The reason that's an easy one is, so the next question is, what kind of values did you both have to agree upon before you got married? Kids was part of that conversation.
Yeah,
but,
definitely.
I'll let you kick it off. What kind of values did you both have to agree upon before you got married?
Okay, so, some of the things are like where we live. Like, thankfully, both of us are not city people. We like to visit them, but we also like to leave them and come back here. Location, like where we live and stuff like that. Like our priorities and things like that. I just said that. We're both very much family people, which is nice. I think it would be hard with both of us if like one of us were very family oriented and the other one wasn't. I think that would cause like quite a few challenges. What else comes to your mind?
Yeah, we talked a lot about the practical stuff before we got married. And then I think that over time turned into more of like the values conversations. But the practical piece is also incredibly important. So, because like you said, like we talked a lot about like location, lifestyle priorities, like how do we want to live our life type of thing. We share a vehicle. Like there's things that just from what was important to us to talk through to make sure we were on the same page with them. Things like family with our parents and our siblings and being close to them and this type of thing. But also, do we want kids and how do we want to raise those kids? And, we were both homeschooled. What would that look like? What about work? Like all of those kind of practical pieces we worked through. And then more of like the deeper stuff kind of came over time of like the spiritual stuff to make sure we're sort of on the same page or in a way that will work together. And then for me, one of the things that came up when I read this question was that we had a lot of sort of discussions and conversations that helped us understand how each other makes decisions. And that I think was one of the most important things. There's no setting or situation that could come up where I think I would be shocked by how you would act in that setting. And I think vice versa,
definitely. Yeah.
So we had a really good understanding of how one another makes decisions. And that tells a lot about people's values and priorities. Because if you understand how they make a decision, you likely understand their values and their priorities. Yeah. So I think prior to getting married, we talked about it in a very practical way, but it shined a light on the deeper layers that we then got into after we got married, really. Yeah. We talked a bit about them, but we didn't get into those kind of deeper layers of our values until after we were already married.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which kind of leads into this next question, which is a long one. And I went back and forth with the person because I needed to ask some clarifying questions. But here's a paraphrased version of that question. Okay.
If stewardship underpins your veganism, what paradigm warranted stewardship ethics? Essentially asking what worldview defines and or demands a stewardship ethic in your lives. I'm interested in the why. In a post, you said you were confronted with the challenge to live in alignment with your values, wondering what presuppositions warranted the change. Curious how that challenge was leveled at you. Was it from a personal relationship, media, or simply self-reflection and self-awareness and a desire to be consistent?
Okay, so it's a big question. I'm going to sort of say my piece, and then we'll talk back and forth about it. So a little bit of context. If you don't follow me on Instagram, this is related to some Instagram posts because I posted about our values, one of which being stewardship.
Yeah.
And that was sort of, that value is really what led to this decision to go vegan. And I talked about how we were sort of confronted with our values, and it essentially sort of forced us to dive into them a little bit deeper and have some conversation. So I'm going to start with the confrontation piece and then how that led to us identifying stewardship as a value, which then resulted in these behavior changes and deciding to embrace this vegan thing. So the confrontation was, we got married in the fall of 2019. So we weren't married for very long, and then spring of 2020 hit, which I'm sure we all remember how that went. And it was a fascinating time, to be totally honest, because it was this global thing that was multifactorial. There's a lot of different components of it that impacted different aspects of people's lives, but it impacted everybody. There was no one who didn't get impacted by it, but people got impacted in different ways, and different parts of their life got impacted in different ways. Because of that, it was something that everybody was pretty passionate about, and people were expressing their opinions about. People were making decisions according to their opinions that they had formed, including organizations making decisions based off of the opinions of the leadership of those organizations. So the confrontation was the interaction that we had with some of these organizations and people that were close to us, or organizations that we were a part of that were making these decisions, or leadership was making some decisions. And it wasn't so much the decisions that were made or the behaviors that were done. It was how those people, or those collections of people, made the decisions. And the way that people made those decisions, how they came to the conclusion that they got to, the thinking that they went through, the logic they followed, and then the behavior that happened as a result of it, seemed to be hypocritical to the values that they expressed that they had were important to them. And, you know, obviously you don't want to like point the finger or judge somebody or a group or whatever without looking at that issue for yourself. So because of that, and that sort of surprise of what was happening with these things that we were a part of and people that we were around, it forced us to be like, are we being hypocritical towards any of our values? Like, like before we get into this with these other people, we should double check ourselves, kind of thing. Yeah. So it created some big conversations around not just our values and how that was interacting with the whole COVID situation, but just in general, what about everything else? And it just sort of opened the door. And I think it was also a time where we had time to have these conversations, right? There wasn't a lot going on. Yeah. So it was sort of front and center, and it allowed us to, everything settled down after the wedding. We weren't traveling as much and all this sort of stuff. So as a newly married couple, it like really gave us the chance to dive into these types of things, specifically sort of into like 2021, when we were about a year into this and we had some time to sort of get our head around it. But then, we were starting to be sort of confronted by these things. So that was kind of the confrontation. Was we identified that, organization that we were sort of a part of and contributing to didn't seem to see the practical component of their values the same way we did. It wasn't aligned. So we had to decide, do we follow our values that we had those discussions and this is how we think they should be acted out in life? Or do we compromise and continue to be a part of and support this thing that isn't lining up with how we see fit? That was a hard thing that, we spent a lot of time talking about, and maybe in the future we'll dive into it a little bit more. But that was the confrontation that started all of this discussion around values. It's hard to explore your values and to see how it impacts your life if you don't identify them. So we spent a lot of time like whiteboard in the living room with coffee, looking at different lists of values and working through different things that were like online to help you identify your values, but also just talking about like, well, what about this? What would that look like if it was acted upon in the world, and figuring out what's important to us. And like, I think one of the beneficial things we did was kind of look at it from a hierarchical perspective of like, this value trumps this value. At the end of the day, if push came to shove, this is the one that would determine the behavior and the decision rather than this one. And that helped us sort of tier these values in certain ways. And eventually, one of the ones that we landed on was this stewardship, the stewardship value. And we kind of came at it sort of from different angles a little bit. But the sort of underlying outcome was essentially the same. Yeah. And for me, part of that was I'm a big fan of philosophy. I've been a fan of it for a long time. And it's why I dabbled in the vegan vegetarian thing for so many years leading up to this point of us really embracing it. One of the philosophers I really like is Simone de Beauvoir. She's an existentialist philosopher from France. I won't get too much into the details, but she has a book called The Ethics of Ambiguity. And in that, it's this sort of discussion around we are individuals, but we are also part of a community. That could be your family, that could be the community that you live in, like your town, that could be your, humans, your species, or, the planet and everything else that's involved in it. With that, because you are a part of these things, you have a responsibility to them. If part of you is oppressed, meaning part of your community is being oppressed or treated unfairly or whatever it might be, that is part of you dealing with that. So for you to experience yourself fully means building up and having sort of this equal freedom of all of these different components of who you are. With that thinking, as well as just the general philosophy of veganism, of harm reduction, and these are individual they're not things, they're individual beings, like they're not just a miscellaneous item. They are having a subjective experience just like you and I are. We should treat them in accordance with that. And we are a part of the same community as them. We should be responsible for it. And as moral agents and able to understand the consequences of our decisions, that gives us moral responsibility. Hopefully this doesn't sound too rambly. It's actually kind of nice to talk it through because I think about it all the time, but I don't actually say it out loud very often. But that's kind of where the stewardship piece came in of like, we are morally responsible for our actions. And we have a responsibility to appropriately manage the things that we have influence on or the actions in which we put out into the world. That's where this came from. If we purchase animal products, we are directly supporting the harm and suffering of animals. And that doesn't seem like a good management or good stewardship. So that's kind of how we ended up getting there. And then it became sort of the difficult decision of like, if that's the case, we need to be careful with our behaviors and the things that we are, supporting and that we have influence over. Anything you want to add to that?
You did a good job. You covered most of it. I don't know. I'm thinking I'm good there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It was a really good question.
It was a good question.
If people are interested, we can talk a bit more about that. Like there's so many ways we could dive into that question. I'm trying to keep it succinct, but even like, where does the concept of morality come from? And all, like, there's a lot of, we could get into that in a bunch of different ways, but maybe we'll do another one of these eventually, or maybe this will spark more questions and we can do a part 2. Cause I think we're like almost an hour in already. So, we'll keep it rolling, but okay. Now more just sort of lifestyle related questions, a little less heavy. Do you think your house will be your forever home?
I'm going to say no. It's funny, when we were like looking for houses, we were like, we want a big property, we want all this stuff. And then we started looking at the prices and it was like, okay, that's not going to happen. So like, very grateful for this house. Like it's our first home. It's always going to be special to us. But I think eventually we both, like, down the road, want to have a place with more property and where we can like do a little bit more. So yeah, I'm going to say no. Like, I love this place, but I don't think we're going to be here forever.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I don't think so either. I don't know when that'll happen.
Yeah, I don't know either.
But I don't think this will be our forever home. Yeah.
Okay. Next question. How many kids do you want to have?
2 or 3.
Yeah.
We've talked about this lots. We say that, and then depending I know other people who had that same idea. They had 1, and then depending on how that circumstance went, their opinions changed.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm not like totally bound to that either.
Yeah, same.
We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
But, cool. Okay, so now a couple sort of fitnessy related questions. When being low income, what's the best way to try and get fit?
I'm gonna let you answer this one, but like right now, what just popped into my head was like calisthenics at home.
Yeah,
but I'll let you dive into this more.
Yeah, I'll hit this from a couple different angles. So, 100% calisthenics, which is just basically using your own body weight for exercise. Think push-ups, pull-ups, sit-ups, planks, all that kind of stuff. Tons of resources online that can help people figure out how to use calisthenics for full body exercise. You can do it at home. You could get some minimal equipment for at home. That could save you some money. You don't have to do the gym membership thing. Be a pretty small investment. If you got a set of rings and had somewhere to hang it, you could do tons of stuff. So that's one way of going about it. The other way of looking at it is like, if a gym membership is, let's use a low end for an example, $50. You could outfit your house, if you're in somewhere where you can do that, with, squat rack, barbell, some weights, a couple dumbbells or kettlebells or something, for about the cost of 2 years of a gym membership. So it seems like a long kind of planning, saving phase, but those things will last you forever. The squat rack I bought in 2015, and it is totally fine. It'll last another couple decades. Yeah. Like, it's an investment that can last you a long time. So it's one way of thinking about it is like, the home gym setup is expensive at first, but compared to the ongoing cost of a membership, can end up resulting in saving you money in the long term. But that saving stage can be hard. The other way is like, you could just get some dumbbells and you could basically do everything with that. With the internet, the nice thing is whatever you could afford to have in your place, because maybe you don't own a house and you can't have a squat rack and everything else. You're in a little apartment or something. You could get like a pull-up bar, some dumbbells, and then just Google or YouTube workouts with those pieces of equipment. Plethora of information. So much out there that could help you with that. So that's kind of the first thing that comes into mind. The other thing is most community center gyms have what's called like a leisure access program. That's what it's called here. It might be called different things in different communities. But essentially, if you're low income, you can typically get like up to a 50% discount on memberships in those types of facilities. That's what we have in Creston. So there is sometimes ways of getting memberships for these different facilities at a reduced rate. I know the YMCA does like sponsored memberships and different things like that. Or you could go the route of investing and getting some things for your personal space. But that's how I would go about it.
Cool. Okay, the next question is for you. I'm going to let you answer this one because I have no idea. They're wanting to know, plantar fasciitis exercises and how to pop and get a good hip release for a frog pose.
Yeah, so very specific. Okay, another quick disclaimer. I'm a kinesiologist. I'm not a physio, not a physician. Just heads up. I don't deal with a lot of acute injuries. So a lot of the times I'm dealing with referrals from physios and different things like that. But I'll give you my perspective. I'll also link to an article below by Barbell Medicine on a guide to plantar heel pain. It's a great article that will, in a way, will say what I'm about to say way more eloquently and in a much more formal manner. But anyways, plantar fasciitis, from my understanding, is largely a loading issue, meaning it's typical in people who run or play sports where they're on their feet all the time. They're having that repetitive impact on their feet. People like cashiers or tradespeople who are on their feet, again, all the time, or individuals who are at a high weight. So it's a loading related issue, which is typical of most injuries, by the way. Most people don't get hurt because they did an exercise improperly or something improperly. Mm-hmm. It's an issue with intensity, volume, essentially intensity and volume, loading in some way, shape, or form. So just an FYI. So this loading issue, there's a couple ways around it. You can reduce the load. So if you're someone who's a larger individual and weight loss is something that you can approach with support of healthcare providers and done in a safe and effective way, that's an option. And that sometimes can help a lot of people. If you're running and you're like just getting into it or a sport or whatever it might be, have a slower progression. It might mean you progress too quickly. The volume, the intensity was too high. You need to slow that down, let your feet get accustomed to it as you build up into that higher load. The other way is you strengthen the joints and the muscles so they can handle a higher load. So for the person who asked this, that might be the case. They might not be able to pull back on the loading. They might have to find a way for their body to support that loading in a better way. So stretching can give some temporary release of the pain, which can then allow you to do exercises to strengthen the feet and the ankles. A couple quick recommendations. There's more stuff in that article that I'll link below, so you can just check it out. But like a really common one is so if you're barefoot or in socks or something, doing calf raises, but having a towel rolled up under sort of your toes and the ball of your foot. So that when you come up in the calf raise, there's nothing supporting the arch of the foot. So then it has to strengthen and hold the arch. So you can develop the musculature of the feet a little bit. If you're wearing shoes and doing calf raises, no bueno, because it's going to add too much support in a sense. So that's one way of going about doing it. Barefoot, towel rolled up under the toes and the ball of the foot, doing calf raises. They'll help strengthen the arch. Then unilateral work, meaning one leg at a time. So doing single leg deadlifts, things like that, can help strengthen the calves and the supporting muscles of the ankle, which can also contribute sometimes to plantar fasciitis. So those are my kind of 2 cents. Doing those exercises kind of through full range of motion as well is also a good idea. Make sure you can maintain that flexibility piece. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with that. The pop and hip release for frog pose, beyond my scope of practice, I have no idea. I'm a fan of what's somewhat appropriately called functional range of motion. I think when it comes to flexibility and range of motion of a joint, it should be done under control and eventually under load. Can you do an exercise through full range of motion of that joint? Can you squat to full depth? Can you hinge and keep your lumbar spine relatively straight? It's not a big deal if it's not, but relatively straight, so you have the hamstring flexibility. Can you do those things actively and then eventually under load through the full range of motion? That to me is like the best form of quote unquote flexibility. When it comes to achieving these extreme ranges of motion or ranges of motion related to like yoga and different things like that, I don't know. I'm not the right person to ask, unfortunately. Sorry.
Okay, and I think this is our last question.
Last question.
Okay, it's a one for you. So it's a question about footwear in the gym. I see people in Converse or Vans that have no arch support, or in socks doing deadlifts or squats. Why?
Yeah, so footwear is something that we actually have some research on. So I'll talk a little bit about research and then a little bit about just what I perceive, what I'm assuming is the case for some of these folks. So research has compared footwear for resistance training in several different comparison contexts. So like, actually, I should list them out. So really what we're comparing is like a running shoe. So that means a shoe that has typically EVA foam in the midsole. So it has that cushion in the midsole of the shoe. So there's rubber, cushion, and then where your foot actually is. There's barefoot or barefoot type shoes. So there's typically no midsole. It's just the rubber, the ground contact, and your foot. Then there is weightlifting shoes, which actually have a heel support and like structure around the shoe. So you have a little bit of a lifted heel and some structure around the shoe. Lastly, there's like, I'm going to call it like CrossFit-y functional fitness types of shoes. They're not a barefoot shoe. They're not a running shoe. They're kind of this like cross training type of shoe. They don't typically have a heel lift. They might have a slight downward angle from heel to toe. So meaning the stack of the heel might be a little higher than the toe. So angles your foot down. But there's usually not EVA foam in the midsole like a running shoe would. It's like hard, kind of more structured. Those are the shoes that often are compared to one another in a bunch of different ways. A couple things that come out of that. Running shoes tend to reduce people's perception of proprioception. So subjectively, they feel like they have less awareness of how their feet and ankles are feeling when they're doing it. Makes sense. The cushion adds a little bit of like instability, particularly in research looking at squatting. So when they're under that kind of heavy load and they have a hard time with their proprioception of their feet. So that's a common outcome that we see in running shoes. That's why like as a trainer and a lot of other trainers don't typically recommend people work out in running shoes just because of that midsole, that EVA foam tends to add a little bit of instability. Not the best for the gym. Barefoot can create some suboptimal torque in joints. So when people exercise barefoot, they often will compensate because they don't have good range of motion or stability within their ankles and their feet. So then their joints go through kind of a torque range of motion. So they get a little bit of twist within the joint. And sometimes that can create a bit of a negative outcome. Hypothetically, that could increase injury risk. So barefoot seems to be questionable depending on how mobile you are. Probably don't want to push through it. And this is, again, research mainly looking at like back squats. So barbell squatting. Flat shoes seem to be just fine. They seem to give better proprioception than with the running type of shoe. And they tend to result in better joint angles than barefoot. So that's why flat shoes like Vans and Converse are really common. People feel sturdy.
I wear Converse at the gym.
And I have lots as well.
I like squatting in them.
Yeah. People feel sturdy and they tend to still, because of the way the shoe is structured, get into good joint positioning. So that's really common. The arch support part of this question is totally individual. Some people need it, some people don't, some people like it, some people don't. If I put on a shoe with arch support, the way my arches are shaped is it doesn't fit my arch, so it's incredibly uncomfortable. So shoes without arch support have historically been way more comfortable for me because my arches can support that position. I don't need support, and shoes that have support aren't the right type of support.
Right.
But I do want to mention that the flat shoes versus the kind of like functional fitnessy types of shoes doesn't seem to be much of a difference. Seems to be personal preference. So whether it's totally flat or that little bit of an angle doesn't really seem to matter all that much. It's just kind of a preference thing. That said, weightlifting shoes do make a difference. So weightlifting shoes have a higher heel. So it's quite a slant down, and then it has some structure on the shoe. If you just look up weightlifting shoes or Olympic weightlifting, look at their feet, there's a reason every competitive Olympic weightlifter wears weightlifting shoes.
Yeah.
It changes your center of mass a little bit and the angle of your torso when deep squatting, which is great for force production through the quads and through that positioning, especially with weightlifting movements. I love squatting with weightlifting shoes on.
I need to get a pair.
Yeah, it's great. Because it will, and research supports the fact that it puts more emphasis on your quads rather than onto like your hamstrings and your glutes. Yeah. So for squatting, which I would argue the whole point of squatting is for mainly your quads, a little bit of glutes, but mainly your quads. It's great for that. There's a reason that power lifters don't wear them and Olympic weightlifters do. Olympic weightlifters are going to extreme range of motion, like full range of motion, deep squatting, and typically high bar. So vertical torso, because when they do a snatch or a clean, they need that vertical torso. That's why it's so beneficial for them. Powerlifters a lot of times are low bar. So the barbell doesn't sit on their traps. It sits on their rear delts. They're more forward and they're only barely breaking parallel. Because that's all they have to do. They don't have to squat all the way down to their hamstrings touching their calves. Yeah. So for them, that flat shoe that's a little bit more sturdy lets them distribute the weight between their posterior chain, their low back, their glutes, and their quads a little bit more than an Olympic weightlifting shoe does. So it's a bit of a preference and a goal-related thing as well. Nerding out on shoes to end it off.
You guys, when we were running last year, the amount of like research, Jesse followed this guy on YouTube and like every day he was so diligent in watching his videos on like shoes and like just always watching videos on shoes. And like he'd have his headphones and I'm like, oh, like what are you listening to? What are you watching? It was like, shoes. So much research on shoes. So hit Jesse up if you have any more shoe questions.
With like in the gym, it's pretty straightforward. Like there's not a lot of complexity. It's like, do you want a weightlifting shoe or just like a flatter shoe? Like it's very unexciting.
But I guess like with the running shoes, like there's so much that goes into it. I had no idea. I like when we first started running, I like went to Sport Checking Crown and like, okay, these Nikes fit. I'm just gonna get like it's so funny like how much
it's crazy. It's a whole science. The different types of shoes will like totally, because it's such a repetitive motion that slight changes in impact and efficiency result in massive outcome differences. So, and it's bananas. I won't get into that today, but if people are curious,
Jesse has the info,
that would need to be a podcast all on itself of talking
you could
just
have
about running shoes.
Like 3 parts to that.
Oh, I have examples. We could put some shoes up here. You could check it all out.
Oh my goodness. Okay, actually, I think in like our relationship podcast, I told you guys when we first started working together, I was like, man, like I need some better shoes. I was like still waitressing a little bit at the time, so I was like, I need good shoes to wear. And Jesse's like, oh, like I have like a whole bunch of kinds, like I can like you can try them on. I'm like, okay. He brought in like a duffel bag full of shoes. It's so good. I have good shoes now that I wear. Like
and so actually a good point on this. We'll wrap up here in a second. Hopefully I know I'll cut here
I
if
know
I
what
need
you're
to.
gonna ask, and you can tell.
Okay. Chantel used to wear stupid shoes, and as a result, she had a bunion.
It was horrible.
On her foot.
I felt like an old lady,
and it was not nice for her. She did not like it. My 2 cents was get rid of all your stupid shoes that are like that's not the shape of a foot. It's a triangle.
Your toes end there.
Yeah. So what's the point? It's silly. It is. They're silly shoes designed by silly people. So
it's true.
We stopped wearing those shoes.
I got rid of all the silly shoes, all the flip flops, and all the flats.
How's your foot doing?
My bunion's gone, you guys. It's good.
Who would have thought?
My favorite was we were like at an event or something, and I was wearing like pointy shoes, and on your piece of paper you were holding, he like drew like the shoes, and then he drew like the toes that went like this, and I'll like never forget that image. And every time I think of like pointy shoes, that's all I think of. Like when I see girls wearing them, I just picture their toes.
It's like your biggest toe isn't in the middle. Why?
No, it's not.
Oh man.
No, they were horrible shoes.
They were, I tell you.
I have happy feet now, you guys.
Makes a big difference.
It does.
All right, we should wrap it up. This is going on too long, but this was a lot of fun.
This was lots of fun.
I'm really grateful for everybody's questions.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Really, really cool. This was a blast for us to do. I hope you guys get something out of it. I'll try to kind of snippet up this and post some of the individual questions on Instagram, so you don't have to listen to this whole thing if you don't want to. And in the description, I will link where the questions start. I'll do a little extra work to try to separate that, so that if you're like, I don't care about shoes, I just want to listen to how they answered my question, you can find that in there. Yeah, thank you so much. We absolutely will do another one of these, probably pretty soon, because it was just a blast for us. And I think obviously this is what people are interested in. And as much as this is for us, it's very much for everybody else too. And it's a way for us to kind of to give back and share in different ways. So I'll stop now. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks guys.
Cool. We'll see you on the next one.